Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. And while you're watching the show today, please remember we're in the midst of our winter fundraising campaign. For every buck you donate, we will have a matching grant of $1. And we can't have discussions and analysis and reports like you're about to see without your support. So please, at some point at this time, if you haven't donated already, somewhere around here is a donate button. But let's get going. Alabama is voting today in a special Senate election for the seat vacated by Jeff Sessions when he became the Attorney General. According to polling, Democratic Party candidate Doug Jones is running neck and neck with Republican Roy Moore, who rode in on a horse to cast his ballot earlier today. I guess this is to prove that he likes the good old days. Aside from Moore's alleged sexual predatory behavior towards teenage girls, a great deal of attention is focused on Moore's comments about the U.S. Constitution, particularly his calling for repeal of the 14th Amendment. Well, according to the Legal Information Institute, the 14th Amendment addresses many aspects of citizenship and the rights of citizens. The most commonly used and frequently litigated phrase in the amendment is equal protection of the laws, which figures prominently in a wide variety of landmark cases, including Brown versus Board of Education, which dealt with racial discrimination in schools, Roe versus Wade, which dealt with reproductive rights, Bush versus Gore, fairness in election recounts, Reed versus Reed, dealt with gender discrimination. Here's Moore on a right-wing radio talk show in 2011. The host says it would be good to eliminate all amendments after the 10th. Moore says that would eliminate many problems in the way government is structured. And then they go on to discuss the 14th Amendment.
That would eliminate many problems. You know, people don't understand how some of these amendments have completely tried to wreck the form of government that our forefathers intended. Well, the danger in the 14th Amendment, which was to restrict, has been a restriction on the states using the first 10 amendments, by and through the 14th Amendment, to restrict the states from doing something that the federal government was restricted from doing, and allowing the federal government to do something which the first 10 amendments prevented them from doing.
So here's an example of the federal government restricting something. In Scott versus Sanford in 1857, the Supreme Court held that African Americans were not U.S. citizens. Let me say that again. 1857, the Supreme Court held that African Americans, even if they're free, were not U.S. citizens. The 14th Amendment, however, guaranteed that everyone born or naturalized in the United States and under its jurisdiction would be a United States citizen. It also ensured that federal citizenship was also made primary, which meant that states could not prevent freed slaves from obtaining state citizenship and thus federal citizenship. As such, the 14th Amendment effectively overturned Sanford versus Scott. In the name of states' rights, this is what Moore wants repealed. Now joining us to discuss the controversy over the 14th Amendment and the state of racism and Trumpism in Alabama is Gerald Horne. Gerald holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's the author of many books, most recently, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance, and the Origins of the United States of America. Thanks for joining us again, Gerald.
Thank you for inviting me.
So before we kind of dig into more modern day Alabama and why this kind of attitude, I should say, of Moore continues and seems to have significant support, at least half of the voters of Alabama, if not a majority. Let's go and look into this issue that they seem to be raising with such seriousness. The issue of the 14th Amendment, even every amendment after the 10th, which includes the amendment that eliminated slavery, but they focus on the 14th. Why do they focus on that?
They focus on the 14th Amendment for a number of reasons. First of all, as background, you should know that The Economist, the British publication, did a major story a few weeks ago detailing how there is a movement afoot in the United States to have a new constitutional convention that potentially and theoretically could not only jump the 14th Amendment, but could jump everything, including the First Amendment. That is to say, the right to freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Second of all, the right wing in the United States objects to the 14th Amendment, not least because they object to what they call birthright citizenship. Recall that under the 14th Amendment, you are a citizen of the United States if you are born in the United States. There has been a hysteria that women from Mexico and from China who are pregnant come into the United States in order to have so-called anchor babies, so that their babies then automatically become residents, if not citizens, of the United States of America, giving them a leg up to gaining citizenship themselves. And then, of course, overthrowing the 14th Amendment in some ways would help to rewrite the results of the U.S. Civil War, which inflicted a wounding defeat upon the so-called Confederate States of America, a defeat that they have been trying to reverse ever since, a defeat that they have been trying to reverse, first of all, by installing monuments to their so-called heroes across the landscape. But now it seems that that is not enough. And so they're going for the entire enchilada, so to speak, to overturn the 14th Amendment, which in many ways would rewrite the narrative of the U.S. Civil War.
Well, certainly one of the leaders of this movement, which is, I mean, to my mind, a neo-fascist kind of movement, is Steve Bannon. And it was an interesting fight between Bannon and Trump in the Republican primary that led to this Senate race, where Trump did not support Moore and Bannon did. Bannon's guy won. Bannon was out campaigning for Moore vigorously just the other day, but so was Trump. And in fact, they're running as much against the, quote, Republican elites as they are the Democratic Party elites. But this Bannon-esque movement, and Moore is becoming the poster child of it, is completely tied up with this ideology of the good old days of essentially slavery.
Well, you are correct. And unfortunately, one of the more insightful analyses of what's going on in the United States has come from the foreign minister of Germany, Sigmar Gabriel, who in a very important speech in Berlin just a few days ago suggested that not only would the European Union have to forge its own path, distinct from the path that has been laid out historically by the United States of America with the EU following behind, but as he sees it, there will be Trumpism for some time to come without Donald J. Trump. And I think that the cutting edge, the leading edge of Trumpism right now is in Alabama, because if Roy Jones emerges victorious with regard to this U.S. Senate election that's unfolding as we speak, it would not only be a victory for Mr. Bannon, it would not only be a victory for Mr. Trump, but the United States is also rather slowly but methodically working its way down a path to try to reverse the results not only of the civil rights movement, but ultimately reversing the results of the U.S. Civil War, which I think would be a disaster, needless to say.
Now, why do you think Moore, first of all, with the accusations of his sexual predatory behavior, as I said, towards teenage girls, all over the country, personalities are falling like dominoes, where seems to be credible accusers, and certainly there seems to be credible accusers of Moore. Seems to be not having that much effect in Alabama, but even more so, the deep racism Moore represents and this kind of politics of opposing constitutional rights for African Americans. Why does that still have such strength in Alabama so many years after this was initially fought?
Well, first of all, I don't think we've dealt honestly with the history of this country. That is to say, even our friends on the left portray a slaveholders' rebellion, which was designed to implant white supremacy forevermore, as a so-called incomplete revolution, which is like calling the installation of apartheid in South Africa in 1948, which was designed to guarantee the rights for those of the European minorities, as a so-called incomplete revolution that somehow neglected and forgot to include the rights of the African majority. But I think also it's important to note that with the changing global climate, with China in the passing lane and gaining and grabbing greater share of global income, a panic has ensued in U.S. ruling circles. And I think that ultimately, in order to understand why Mr. Trump and Mr. Bannon and those who back him, including the Mercer family, the billionaire family from New York, in order to understand why they're backing this neo-fascist Roy Moore, you have to understand the panic that has ensued in U.S. ruling elite circles, at least a portion of that circle, with regard to the changing global climate and how it does not spell well for the future of the U.S. ruling elite.
So why does that lead them to support Moore, who plays out so badly for most of the Republican Party leadership, who are trying to distance themselves from him?
Well, first of all, as you know more than most, there is a split within U.S. ruling circles. That is to say that if the Trump faction of the U.S. ruling elite somehow prevails, it seems to me there will be a shakeout within the U.S. ruling elite itself, and there will be losers, just like there are going to be losers within the U.S. working class if Mr. Moore emerges triumphant. I think ultimately the goal of the Trump faction is to basically prevail in terms of their ongoing class conflict with the U.S. ruling class. And ultimately, it will spell doom, I'm afraid, for those at the bottom of the U.S. working class, which ultimately speaks to the fate of the black and brown sector of the U.S. working class.
Part of this vote in Alabama is also to do with changing demographics. The longer-term demographics are certainly a large increase in the Latino population. More and more blacks are getting engaged in voting than in the past, at least in the recent past, other than perhaps Obama. Is part of what's going on here an attempt to consolidate as much as they can this power, certainly based on rural Alabama, and deal with voter suppression? I mean, certainly the 14th Amendment also dealt with issues of voting rights, which is another reason they don't like it.
Well, keep in mind that California is a negative example for the Republican Party. It's no accident that many within the Trump circle, including Steve Bannon, Steve Miller, and a host of others, spent time in Southern California, including the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin. Keep in mind that California now has a black, brown, and Asian majority. Keep in mind as well that with that black, brown, and Asian majority, it has become very difficult for the Republican Party, the party of whiteness, to prevail. The Republican Party basically is on a path to extinction in the state of California. That is one of the reasons why you have this attack on the 14th Amendment and its provisions for so-called birthright citizenship. That is why the Bannon wing of the Republican Party has put so much emphasis on Roy Moore prevailing. That is why you've had an attack on the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And that is why voter suppression in the state of Alabama has been so successful, to the point where a significant percentage of the black vote in Alabama will not be able to weigh in, not only because of voter suppression and the fact that you have voter ID laws, and then the places where you get voter IDs have been shut down, but also because of felony disenfranchisement. That is to say, the prison industrial complex sweeps up black men and black women to a larger degree in particular. And then when you have a felony on your record, you're not able to vote. Alabama, in some ways, is a laboratory that is pointing to the direction of U.S. politics going forward in the 21st century.
There's questions come in, and let me say again, we're live on therealnews.com. We're live on Facebook, YouTube, and maybe some other places. So we will take some questions over the course of this discussion. There's a question here from Max Parthas. He says, let's remember to talk about the 13th Amendment, how it continues to allow slavery to exist in Alabama nationwide. And by that, he means mass incarceration. He says Alabama's prisons are 200% capacity.
Well, of course, I'm sure the caller or the writer is familiar with the documentary 13th by Ava DuVernay, which presents a very graphic portrait of what we refer to colloquially as the prison industrial complex. But it's also important to note that the other amendments beyond the first 10 amendments in the United States Constitution also deal with such issues as the 15th Amendment, which deals with voting rights. It also deals with the right of 18-year-olds to vote as well. And it would not surprise me at all if there is a movement to get rid of that amendment, because, as is well known, younger voters are not as in favor of the Republican Party as older voters, particularly older white voters, tend to be. So I think that we have to gear up for an all-out assault on our democratic rights in this country.
Alabama is one of the poorest states in the country. I think GDP per capita I think Alabama's about 43rd or something on the list. Many of the whites who will be voting for more today are poor, poor workers, poor out-of-work workers, but they're voting for a candidate who's very associated, as you said, with Trump and his billionaire backers, and I know they have all the rhetoric of running against the GOP elites, but they're voting for politics that clearly are not going to do much to better their well-being, and there's a long history of them voting that way, and their well-being does not get better. I mean, how do you explain these deep-rooted attitudes in Alabama that just don't seem to change in spite of how bad conditions are for most of the working white people of the state, even though it might be better than black people?
Well, look at the U.S. Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The question then was, why would so many young men defined as white who were not slave owners vote to perpetuate the racial plutocracy of a handful of slave owners? I think in order to understand and answer that question, you have to understand that as they saw it, they were on the bottom rung then, but with a little pluck and a lot of luck, they could gain the stolen land from Native Americans somewhere down the road and be able to stock that land with enslaved Africans. That's point number one. Point number two, if you fast forward to the late 20th century and today, you've seen an all-out attack upon labor unions in this country, which has helped to suppress, if not repress, class consciousness to the point where many in the white working class do not necessarily identify themselves with their class. They identify themselves with their, quote, race, unquote, which puts them at cross purposes with those who are not part of that race, mostly in Alabama, speaking of the black working class.
And do you think some fault for this should also be laid at the Democratic Party and many of the union leaderships, not all, but many of the unions, who simply gave up on the white working class of the South? And they don't work there. They don't campaign there. And if it wasn't for this kind of anomaly of the sexual accusations against Moore, I mean, I don't think Doug Jones and his candidacy would be doing very much here. This would be kind of just written off by the Democratic Party as a place not worth spending money on. Did they not just give up on these people?
Well, I think the fatal flaw actually begins in the 20th century with the all-out war against socialism, which led to an all-out war against unions, which were seen as a stalking horse for socialism. That led to a deal that was cut with the People's Republic of China some 4 odd decades ago, where China was slated to be a low-wage haven for U.S. transnational corporations forevermore. But China has now turned the tables and is now surging ahead. It's in the passing lane, particularly with regard to 21st century technologies like quantum computing, like green energy, like robotization, et cetera. And therefore, the U.S. ruling elite is panicked. They feel that they have to dig more out of the hide of the U.S. working class in order to prevail against China in this global race. And therefore, you see the Mercer family and the Trumps and the Bannons supporting Roy Moore in order to perpetuate that goal of digging more out of our hides so that in their minds, they can prevail in this titanic conflict with the People's Republic of China.
Yeah, Bannon positions everything in relation to the battle with China and what he calls Islamic fascism or Islamic terrorism, but more focused on China these days, it seems. Another question that's come in from, this one's on YouTube. It's being reported on MSNBC, this is Loudon, 1780 is his name on YouTube, that the election participation is expected to be only around 25%. How much of it is voter suppression? What are the reasons? Is there something specific to Alabama? It is kind of odd if they're right, it's about a 25% turnout with such a hotly contested election.
Well, I agree with that. But keep in mind that, as is well known, Doug Jones can only win if there's a massive turnout from the Black American vote. But as I sift through the tea leaves, I don't see Doug Jones making the kind of impassioned appeal to Black voters that would drive them to the polls. It's more or less a justifiable attack on Roy Jones and what he portends. But you have to put forward a positive agenda. Now, from Mr. Jones' point of view, he realizes that if he makes an impassioned appeal to black voters, that would only gin up the racist white vote and therefore might serve as a backfiring mechanism on his part. So right now, that is the dilemma that is faced by the anti-GOP forces in the state of Alabama.
Doug Jones does not seem to be presenting a Sanders-esque kind of campaign. And Sanders clearly in many areas, I'm not so sure about Alabama, but in many areas of the country that are pro-Trump, Sanders actually does pretty well because he has also anti-elite message. I don't know, would you think that would have played out better in Alabama?
Possibly. It's really hard to say. I mean, given the dearth of class consciousness in the United States of America, given the fact that unions are more or less on their back, given the fact that their percentage of representation of the U.S. working class is in a long-term decline, we face a very steep uphill climb in the United States of America. That's not to say that I'm endorsing or supporting the rather tepid platform of Mr. Jones. If I were in Alabama, I would certainly cast a vote for him, if only as a blocking mechanism against Roy Jones. But I'm afraid to say that many black voters in the state of Alabama, after witnessing decade after decade of Republican Party hegemony in that state, probably feel that it's a futile gesture to try to get in front of the Republican Party steamroller, which seems to be rolling ahead effortlessly.
One of the reasons they are is the extent the rural vote seems to count for more than the urban vote, where there are more African Americans and more educated white workers, too. This also was something dealt with in the 14th Amendment at one point. How much does that still play a role, that the rural vote simply gets counted with more emphasis than the urban vote?
Well, I mean, look at the presidential election. Look at the Electoral College, which gives voters in Wyoming, which has a population of about 500 or 600,000, in some ways an advantage over a state like California, which has 33 million people. That is to say that Wyoming has 2 U.S. senators and California has 2 U.S. senators. Now, in the 1960s, as part of the attack against the right wing, you not only had the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, you had a number of Supreme Court decisions, such as Baker versus Carr and Reynolds versus Sims, which sought to install the principle of one person, one vote. That is to say that before these Supreme Court decisions, voting representation oftentimes was based upon geography. That is to say, it empowered rural areas in states like Texas that had a large geographic reach, but did not have many people. I think that one of the attempts made by Mr. Moore and his supporters in order to overthrow the 14th Amendment is precisely to overthrow those Supreme Court decisions and help to empower further rural areas like in northwestern Alabama, which right now is the citadel of Roy Jones' support.
So reading through the tea leaves here, the press seems to be suggesting in the latest polls that Moore is likely to win this today. As I say, we're doing this before, as the vote is going on, so people may be watching this later, and we may know the winner at this point. It's probably likely to be Moore. What does that mean? There's sort of a debate. Does this mean anything nationally, or is this really something specific to Alabama?
Well, with regard to nationally, keep in mind that the Republicans did not prevail in the Virginia gubernatorial race, but that had a lot to do with the turnout not only of black voters, but also in the area stretching south from Washington, D.C., through Fairfax County, through Arlington, all the way down to Dulles Airport, where you have a substantial percentage of Asian American voters and Latino voters who turned out against the GOP. Now, proportionately in Alabama, you just do not have as large a percentage of Asian American voters as you have, say, in Northern Virginia, or of Latino voters as you have in Northern Virginia. So it's going to be difficult to say, if Roy Jones wins, what this means for the rest of the country. Certainly, I think it will help many to understand that in Dixie as a whole, the Republican Party outside of Virginia still has a strong foothold. With regard to the so-called Christian evangelical vote, or the white Christian evangelical vote, If Roy Jones wins, that vote will be a major reason why. And I think that it will help to unmask that vote. That is to say, if they vote for an apologist for slavery, for a sexual predator, that certainly helps to undermine and vitiate their notion that they're voting in favor of so-called morality and values. What it will help to reveal is that their major principle is white supremacy, with religion as a kind of mask to obscure that fundamental principle.
I maybe misheard you, but I think you were saying Roy Jones and you meant Roy Moore, right?
Oh, sorry. I'm thinking of the heavyweight boxer.
All right. Well, we're going to wrap it up for now. We'll be back tomorrow. We'll talk about the results and such. Any final comment about what the significance of this vote is?
Well, I think that if Roy Moore prevails, it'll be a dark day, not only for the state of Alabama, for the United States of America as a whole. It will portend a situation where you basically have a double standard. That is to say, the mainstream press has talked about how Al Franken was chased out of the U.S. Senate so that the Democrats can claim the high ground with regard to this emerging issue of sexual harassment and sexual predation. But another way to look at it is that if you're a Republican, you get a free pass with regard to sexual harassment, sexual predation, even with regard to pedophilia. That is to say, if you're Donald J. Trump and you're being accused by at least a dozen, if not 16 women of sexual harassment, you are not forced to resign. If you're Roy Moore and you're accused of pedophilia, you can still be elected to U.S. Senate. But if you're a Democrat like John Conyers or like Al Franken, you're forced to walk the plank. I think that's a very dangerous signal to send, but I'm afraid that's what we're faced with as we speak.
Just to add to that, if Moore wins, this becomes a great victory for the far right of the billionaire class, the Robert Mercers, the Sheldon Adelson, and whose frontman is Steve Bannon. And it changes a lot, I think, the dynamic between the Bannon-esque wing of the party and the Mitch McConnell and more standard Republican Party. I think it's a real shot at them that they can whip up and are willing to whip up the most overt racism in order to achieve their objectives. And it puts on notice this Republican Party leadership that either they're going to succumb to this more open fascism or they're likely to go down themselves.
Well, I think we also have to sharpen our analysis. If you go back and look at the press clippings in the late fall of 1991, when David Duke, a Nazi and Klansman, won 55% of the white vote running for governor of Louisiana, all the press clippings suggest that it was economic anxiety that drove so many white voters to the polls to cast a ballot in favor of him. They tended to downplay the fact of racism. And that is a weakness, including on the left in the United States. That is to say, they become born-again Marxists, or more precisely, born-again economic determinists when it comes to analyzing a David Duke or a Donald Trump or a Roy Moore, and they tend to downplay naked racism, which is a fundamental flaw and a fundamental error.
But the naked racism perpetuates itself because, as you said earlier, the origins of it is that it serves the billionaire class, and they weren't billionaires back when, to divide the poor whites and the poor blacks. And there continues to be such poverty and such amongst the poor whites in Alabama, and it is now as it was then. It's just a hell of a lot easier to blame blacks for your misery than to blame the elites.
Exactly, but I think that a diagnosis leads to a prescription. That is to say, if part of your diagnosis is that racism is at issue, then you conduct an all-out assault on racism. If your diagnosis is that it's purely economic anxiety, then you focus wholly and exclusively on that issue, and oftentimes you ignore the propulsion of racism. And I think that's the mistake that's being made as we speak.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I'd also say, including ourselves, independent media spends very little time covering the Deep South. And I'd love to have a full-time journalist that does nothing but. In fact, if someone's out there got some money help us pay for one salary to start with, and we'll have a journalist that does nothing but covers these issues in the Deep South. It's way past due. Thanks very much for joining us, Gerald.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us live on the Real News Network.